Good morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Plus. It is the fourth day of December. That means we are officially out of the 2024 hurricane season. Hear the crowd cheer in the background. We finally made it to the end of this season, and it's been quite a season. We're going to talk about that today with a number of people. But before we get to that, let's thank our sponsors who make this show a possibility, have done so all hurricane season long, and we hope to see everybody back again next year. USAA. My goodness, we can't say thanks enough for everything USAA has done for the Storm Science Network, for the National Tropical Weather Conference, and all the projects we do. Thank you, USAA. You've been part of it from the very beginning. We appreciate that. The South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the home of the National Tropical Weather Conference, will be back there again April 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of 2025. Registration now open at hurricanecenterlive.com. Check that out and get registered ASAP so you can be on the list. The Weather Company, Weather Boy, and Weather Call, all folks that make these a possibility week in and week out throughout the hurricane season and for 1 week after the hurricane season. Hence, we're here today. Coming up a little bit later on in the program, Mark Sudduth is going to join us from Hurricane Track to talk about the season. And then Shel, Winkley, and Daniel Gilford both are going to talk about has human-induced climate change impacted hurricanes, and the results of the study say certainly has. So we're going to talk about that in the second half hour. But joining us this morning to say hello and get the program started, former director of the National Hurricane Center, our friend Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill.
Hey, Tim. You getting enough rain down there out of this little coastal low? Winter has arrived.
Yeah, boy, it really has. We're talking today about how we have to turn lights on in the room because usually it's open the blinds and there's plenty of light to do this, but it's gray out there today. And yesterday at the coast, it was 75 and raining, and where I live, 70 miles inland, it was 58 and raining. So big contrast with that coastal low.
Yeah, we're supposed to get an initial round of rain today out of it as it gets kicked eastward by a short wave, and then apparently now a stronger one's going to grind up another coastal low Saturday night through Sunday night, and we might get 2 to 4 inches of rain.
That's wreaking havoc with our forecast for the McAllen Christmas Parade, which is a big deal Saturday night. It's going to either be 58 or 88. I don't know, somewhere in between. Opting for the 58 side right now.
Yeah, I was invited to participate in a holiday parade and said, you don't want a weatherman there. It's outdoors. It'll just bring you rain.
Happens.
I don't need the grief. Plus, I had another commitment anyway, so it got me out of that one.
There you go. There you go. Well, good morning. Hope things are well in your part of Texas.
Oh, yeah. Yep, it's been nice and cool. After December, it can be cold and it won't bother me at all. Now, come February and it's still cold, I've forgotten how hot weather feels, and I'm ready to turn up the heater a little.
Get the golf game going again. Yeah, absolutely. Crank it up. So hurricane season's over, Bill. We're 4 days into December. Today's show basically just to wrap up what the season brought and some details about that. Second half hour again, we'll talk with Shel, Winkley, and Daniel Gilford. But this first half hour, somebody who's been in the middle of a bunch of these, Bill, our friend Mark Sudduth, right?
Yeah, let's bring Mark into the program here. I don't think we had you 3 times this year, but it's certainly the second time we've had you on our show this year, and quite a lot of activities occurred since we last spoke. And again, for anyone that may not know of Mark, he's been with us throughout our 13 plus years of doing NTWC, and he has the company Hurricane Track, and he puts remote sensors in harm's way and gives us wonderful data and videos to show for it. Welcome aboard, Mark.
Good to be back with you. Here we are on the other side of what was projected to be an impactful year, and we were all very worried about it, and we got to that happened, but how we got there was a little bit different. We didn't think that it was going to be as backloaded as it was, but what a year, and really emphasizing again that water, I think, is still our biggest problem with tropical cyclones versus wind. Maybe we're building better to fight against the wind, although parts of Houston area dealt with the wind from Beryl, and that's a different story altogether. We still have some infrastructure issues, but by and large, you guys saw, Western North Carolina with the rain, and we don't want to leave out upstate South Carolina, parts of Georgia either. But, even to that end, Helene did bring one of the biggest wind swaths inland as well. So we don't want to completely discount the wind. Not saying that at all, but just another reminder of how water, as useful as it is, and it makes up most of our bodies, all that kind of stuff, man, it's still, very much a foe at times.
Yeah, but before we get into the water part of it, I had a conversation with Mike Brennan last week at a conference, and the death toll from wind in Helene is the largest loss of life from wind since we've had in a storm since 1963.
Wow.
Really, I did not know that.
Yeah,
So tree damage and stuff like that, like what would be the
mostly
primary?
trees on cars or houses.
Wow. And most of that is in Georgia, I would suspect.
Uh,
I have to email Dr. Brennan and ask him because that is fascinating.
I didn't.
Not in a good way, but you're right. I mean, remember that, what was it, Mr. Rappaport that used to do, see a doctor too? I don't,
Yeah.
you're in those PhDs, he used to do that pie chart. It was a little sliver that was wind. And so for the first time in 40 plus years now, wow, I
Yeah,
didn't know
Mike,
that,
Mike
Bill.
showed an updated version of that increased the wind part.
Right.
But his real reason for showing that was that since we've gotten into the storm surge warning and tried to educate people better on it, the loss of life from storm surge as a percentage over a longer period of time in the recent decades has gone down.
Right, but the inland flooding and deaths in vehicles, and then this year people just being swept away in western North Carolina, that's still a too big of a piece of that pie chart. But it was a challenging season. I mean, we thought that once we had Beryl that we were just going to go full tilt the whole season. Then we had that dead zone in there that was very confusing and strange, and in between Beryl and eventually Helene, we had Ernesto. And I'm going to tell you, one of the big advancements this year was our use of Starlink. We had one of the originals, and then I got the Starlink Mini that's literally the size of an iPad Pro or something. It's not much bigger than my Santa Claus picture that my daughter made for me, the little plate, whatever. It's everything right in that plate, and you can plug it into a cigarette lighter deal, and you're good to go. And I took that to Bermuda for Ernesto, and I'm driving around Bermuda. Well, we had a driver, this guy Howard, a good friend of ours of the project, and we're live, like in a hurricane in Bermuda from Starlink. It's like incredible. Same thing for Francine in Louisiana, going all the way down to Sippermore Point and all those remote areas of the marshes of Louisiana. And we're streaming live, but more important than that is being able to get the information down. And, the download speeds from Starlink are just unbelievable. And then using it during Milton. And we're really looking to utilize it because it is cost effective just for the hardware, and then the monthly subscription rate is very reasonable, very comparable to terrestrial plans like I've got with Verizon. And we're thinking about developing what we call some Starlink clusters, where we'd have a master setup of Starlink and a way to power it and all that, and then several cameras based off of it for places like Grand Isle or these Cocodrie or something that are just remote, or someplace like the Keys or elsewhere that might get walloped by a hurricane that's going to take out the terrestrial network. And yes, we have run it during the eye walls of hurricanes, and you don't get your same throughput, but it still works. It doesn't seem to suffer the rain fade. Alex, how do you pronounce, it's the guy that's the meteorologist for SpaceX. He was
Phil
at the
Manoogian.
conference.
Phil
Yes.
Manoogian. Yeah.
Phil. The last name is hard for me, so we'll just call him Phil. He was very interested in this, and I gave him a lot of data and sent him radar shots of when I was using Starlink, and he passed that on to the SpaceX team. I mean, you talk about advancements. We've done a lot at Hurricane Track, but what SpaceX has done with Starlink and how that's enabled us to work in the field, and how we're going to be able to work in the field going forward, is, I think, going to be really remarkable, because we're going to be able to reach some of these remote places. We're going to be able to operate even in, something like a Michael or an Irma, like Irma down in the Keys. You remember, Bill, that was pretty bad. Was it a 4 when it went through the Middle Keys or whatever? And
Yeah.
there was like a big line or something, the transmission line that went down, and all the storm chasers down there, which I wasn't one of them because that's why we have the cameras, right? They lost connectivity. So now we don't have to worry about that. So to me, technologically, that was a big advancement for this year.
So does the Starlink work on a battery?
Yeah, yeah.
How much battery do you need to successfully go with it?
So we've got a now getting right down to the amp hours and whatnot. I don't know the exact answer, but we have a Jackery, and I have to look on it to see what the capacity is, but it runs the thing for about 20 hours off just this. It looks like a cooler, like an igloo cooler. The Jackery, these battery powered generators, as they call them. And so that would sit in the back of our truck, and that would run Starlink right off of, was it AC power, I guess, right? I always get those confused. You literally would just plug it into the brick. But now there's all sorts of third-party gadgets that you can, cigarette lighter, there's USB-C directly to like a battery pack. I don't have one handy, but there's a lot of ways to power Starlink. And it works in motion. And we've discovered some things about it that we're going to keep proprietary because they're going to help us in our work of ways we can use it in the field that I think will really help see the storm surge and other effects in some of these remote areas, and hopefully even starting to get down into the Caribbean islands. I took a couple GoPros down to Grand Cayman in July, and of course the GoPros don't transmit live, not ours. That's not what they're made for. But now with Starlink, we're looking at really like the special they had. They're like $500 or $600. That's not a lot of money when you're talking tech that can solve these kind of problems. And so maybe being able to arm our friends in the Cayman Islands and maybe eventually Jamaica and the Bahamas, working with these folks. And that's what we do at these conferences, right? We meet them, we collaborate, we come up with these ideas. Now we have ways to improve on hopefully even Caribbean hurricane coverage. And I don't even have to go there. Just show these people how to use them. I mean, we have come a long way in 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking where I was going with that is when a hurricane hits, you're telling people to get information from their local officials. How? They're gone. There's no communication. The battery operated internet access may be one of the ways to do that.
Yeah, well, eventually, I think Starlink has an agreement with T-Mobile that phones, and I think they activated some of that in the wake of Helene. Come on, Tim, you got to get Elon on someday to talk about this. I'm sure just send him a text. He could tell us, or Phil might be good. I know he works on the meteorology side, but there is a lot that's going to be coming that will really help people in the future. And we're not even talking about 5 or 10 years. In the next couple of years, heck, even in the next year, you never know, especially with T-Mobile and the Starlink connection, that it will be easier to get information and share information of I'm okay or I need help or whatever. And all the different people that were distributing Starlink in Western North Carolina. I saw on the SpaceX website, Starlink website, that areas affected by Helene and Milton, there were no service charges through December or something like that. Didn't mean this to turn into a Starlink commercial, but it is one big thing that really helped us this year, not just operationally in the now, but what we could do in the future. I was literally in the car talking with Matt and different people on my team. You know what we could do with this? We could totally go down to Sycamore Point or Cocodrie or Grand Isle and set up some kind of like system where everything's just right there, 2 or 3 cameras on it, and leave it and come back and get it when it's over, whatever. And you could probably do it for under $2,000. That's incredible. Mm-hmm. And we can get the Hurricane Center verifiable surge data, the public emergency management. We can just continue what we've done for 20 years now using literal space technology to make it happen. That's one of the good things that has come out of this hurricane season.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, leapfrogging into the future.
Speaking of Helene, What all did you do relative to Helene? Did you have a pretty good presence down in the Big Bend of Florida again?
Yeah, just the biggest complaint that, and we'll see. We were joking before the show. We'll see if Doge, the Vivek and Elon deal there, can get rid of daylight savings time. Let's see if they can also get rid of nighttime landfalls while they're at it. You want to make everything more efficient? That would be a lot better. I mean, really. I'm all kidding aside. Why are these at night like this? This is so annoying. But we did the best we could to answer your question. We had multiple camera systems in Cedar Key, working with our friend that spoke at this year's conference, Robert Robinson, the fire chief and emergency management director, and this other guy that used to be a producer on Fear Factor, Scott Larson, at the Tiki Bar, Low Key Hideaway. Cameras inside, outside, all over the place, just trying to show that surge from different perspectives. And then up at the Steinhatchee River, and I'll be able to show this at the conference in April and really dissect it and understand what we've got, where we turn the video into data. Because, when it's happening, it's more like eye candy. We know that. But then how do you extract the science out of it? Well, we're working on that. Bill, I'm telling you, when you see the velocity of this surge that came up the Steinhatchee from that camera, and you realize that's not time lapse. That's not one of Mark's cool time lapse. It's real time. And that is not a raging river like what we saw in Asheville and the Swannanoa and whatnot during the day. This was at night, and this was storm surge generated, and it looked like something that was going to be happening in Asheville and Western North Carolina the next day. It was terrifying. I mean, the velocity, I never would have expected that. And I think that's going to be very helpful for people, because that can happen on other river systems in the United States and abroad. And just the amount of debris that was coming by, and some of it was enormous. And what it took to do that at the Steinhatchee. And then in Cedar Key, just, again, amazing evidence of how the surge does what it does. And it was all at night, so we took full advantage of our night vision on the cameras. So we had much closer shots, and you have to think about it like that. And we were able to capture exactly what happened and when it happened. We even tried some 360 work. But again, it was at night, and there's only so much you can do with artificial lights. And I've said this time and again, you can have all the Hollywood lighting you want, but when you get into the teeth of a hurricane, it's just going to look like you're inside of a car wash at night, which Jeff Pietrowski has done. If Harvey, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, the
famous car wash scene from Rockport. Anyway,
the people that live in those places that have seen you a couple times now, were they out of there pretty much?
Yes, they were. And that's why they appreciate the cameras, because they could see what was going on. And look, to Verizon's credit, and full disclosure, I am a bill-paying Verizon customer. There's no discounts, there's no sponsorship. I have just very clear on that. So I have no interest in supporting it if it's not true. You know what I mean? And we couldn't believe that every camera we set up for Helene from Tampa to St. Mark's was up and running over the Verizon network all throughout that night. Even a couple of the camera systems, and we've had this happen before, went underwater. And that's just a whole weird physics thing that I'm sure there's some depth of water that eventually, if you put your iPhone in a LifeProof or one of those bags, how far down in the water until it's not going to transmit? We weren't talking like these are 10 feet underwater, but there was times, it was right on Fox Weather there, the camera was underwater, streaming live, like you saw the little Nest thing. It was live. And that's all Verizon there, that their network stayed up. Look, it goes down later. The generators only last so long. I get that, but you get me all fired up talking about these stories. But yes, the people appreciated being able to see these things, especially the business owner there, Scott, Robert, seeing what was happening at the waterfront. And then, the other thing about Helene I want to mention is how incredibly high the surge was in Tampa Bay along Bayshore, where we put one of the cameras. It was 7 feet up, and the water just came up under the camera. 6 feet of actual water rise, and then the waves were coming over the camera. And these are like $1 million houses on the right side of the shot. Again, I'll show you all at the conference when everything's composited out and ready to go for my block. And how far away was that from the landfall? Like, that is extraordinary. These continual lessons that we keep getting taught about, people say it's going to the Big Bend or whatever. Well, what about Tampa and the big surge there, all the way down to, even Sarasota and Nokomis had pretty big surge. Siesta Key from Helene as it went by. This is just this massive snowplow of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Just a remarkable season of, you thought you've seen it all, and then we keep getting surprised. I remember Max told me a long time ago, he was surprised that I was surprised. I'm like, come on, Max. Sometimes, even though you know this stuff, you still get surprised.
Yeah, I guess after a while though, you've seen enough surprises that you're expecting it to be different than what you're forecasting. You just know there's going to be some idiosyncrasies in there. But the Helene was fast moving, paralleling the coast, very large. So you had a large wind field,
Huge.
build up a tremendous run up out ahead of it. So that's where and on that continental shelf there, you're going to get storm surge the entire length of its path.
Yep.
And it
But,
should be a good lesson that
until you see it, right? You don't believe it.
No, that's right. The best prepared people are people that have already been hit by a storm, which is not the way we want it, but that's human nature. Hopefully, the Tampa Bay area will take away from this is, look how bad the surge was from a glancing blow. This is why we tell you have to leave.
Yep, it's as aggravating.
Houses slab on grade near sea level, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And they were still moving sand out of Clearwater, the beach, back to the beach when I was over there 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, all these close calls for Tampa, and then Milton we thought, this really could be the one, and 25 miles, I guess, made the difference in such a weird trajectory. I don't know, man. NTWC next year might need to go through the weekend and end on a Sunday instead of the usual. We have got a lot to unpack.
Yeah. Speaking of Milton, did you have where did you deploy for Milton?
So another one at night. Darn that nighttime stuff. Milton, we were very strategic and very surgical with that, I guess is a good way to put it. Working in a couple of different specific spots. One was Sarasota, the other one was Venice, actually 3 total. Third was Punta Gorda. Knowing that it was going to be at night, we very purposefully set our shots up so that the night vision would work. So in Punta Gorda, we'll go from south to north, put the camera right in front of this, it was at the marina, this yacht that was left. And sure enough, the water came up, the yacht broke loose, twisted around, took out a houseboat next to it, all right in front of that camera. Just extraordinary to watch. And then surge went away, the yacht tilted, and it was there. Thousands of people taking pictures of it the next day. Camera still running, caught the whole thing. Moving up the coast to Nokomis and the Venice area, I worked with a terrific family there that let us use their house. And we had cameras inside, outside. And again, a lot of this I can't wait to show at the conference because it's going to be groundbreaking for what we can do in the future of showing people storm surge, not just from the outside, but inside, because that's where it's very personal, very intimate. It's where our stuff is, right? And then Siesta Key, same kind of thing. Worked with a gentleman there, actually working with property owners more than ever this year. Had the camera underneath his house. He had it just getting the repairs done post Helene. And then Milton comes in, and this is one cool thing I can't wait to show. This is the surge. We think we caught the pressure surge because you see the surge come up, and then there's this pretty rapid rise of about 2 feet, coincidental when the eye came in, but there's hardly any wind. And it's really neat to watch that still water level jump like that. And then it just drains away. So that might have been the actual pressure surge. I was talking with Taylor Trogdon about it. And then where else do we have stuff? Oh, Sarasota, which was interesting because the eye went right over there basically. And the way the surge came in there wasn't very high, but it's always interesting. Everything we capture, there's a story to tell and data to extract from it. And then my last story here for Milton, I had tickets to Hans Zimmer, the composer, right? This guy, Hans Zimmer Live. I was supposed to go, talk about bad planning, September 10th, Raleigh. Nope, couldn't do it because I had to be in Francine. So the backup was September 27th, Denver. Nope, didn't do it because I had to go deal with Helene. And so the final one was October 12th in Las Vegas. It was literally his final show of the tour. And I got out of Florida after Milton, drove home, and there's nothing for me to do down there anyway the day after. You just get in the way. And it was flooding really bad. So went home, hopped on a plane with my wife. We flew to Vegas, and I saw Hans Zimmer and pulled off the ultimate have your cake and eat it too. Well
Wow.
worth it.
Cool. That's amazing.
So, and I needed it. I needed to just disconnect from, I mean, it had been one heck of a year, especially Western North Carolina. It's where my parents lived for 30 years, and it's my home state. It was, sometimes you got to do that. And, as much of a film music lover as I am, that was the cherry on top of a very successful year operationally. So,
yeah, there's a lot of storms that deserve a lot of study. The one over here, Beryl, I think the focus will be on the power issues. The public health people and the science officer Lance Wood at HGX have done a study on heat-related fatalities post Beryl, and it's not final yet, so I won't give you actual numbers, but it's fairly huge.
so it's going to show up on the pie chart. I mean, not trying to make light of it, but I mean, that's
that'll be the indirects. That'll be the indirects. A lot, you got a population of 7 million people, even though it's a fairly young demographic, Houston, you still got a lot of old codgers like me running around here and don't have enough common sense to move away. But heck, one of the places I would have considered moving would have been Asheville, North Carolina. And I doubt that I would have had a house on a hill, but who knows?
I wonder how our friend Steve, didn't he moved up there? I just thought of that. We should check in with Steve Ayers. Wasn't that his last name?
Yeah, Steve's on a hill. He's okay. I actually heard from him like right before, just on text on Facebook, but right before Liquid Armageddon cut loose there, and then shortly, as soon as he had power back, he was on Facebook saying he's okay, but the city's a mess.
Sure.
But yeah, he's on a hill, so as long as he's far enough away from the edge, if you get slope failure and whatnot to mess with your house, you're okay. But they had at the Flash conference, the keynote speaker was a director of Mennonite Disaster Services. They went, they're already out there building bridges.
Yeah.
3,000 bridges wiped out because a lot of people live on the other side of the river. Some of that in the Texas Hill Country. You'll have a small bridge that crosses the stream. They're all gone.
Yeah.
And so basically they're in their houses, and how do you get stuff to them? You got to build the bridges. So it's just monumental, the amount of small communities that got wiped out by that storm.
Mm-hmm. And we go back to that term, societal impacts, and that's what it did. And it was, that was one of the fears, that this would be and it could take just one, we know that, but this season just seemed like it was ripe for one of those generational, and Western North Carolina, I mean, it's worse than anybody thinks, and just the continuous coverage that's gone on up there. Luckily, a lot of the national media has still focused on it, and I see it because I live here in Eastern North Carolina. I mean, it is one of those ones that'll be before Helene and after Helene. There will be little placard monument things, whatever, 100 years from now, and Helene will be that flood of record.
Yeah. It's amazing. Tim, what you got?
Well, just Mark, as we get, and we're just about to the end of the time here, but as we get close to as we're past the end of the hurricane season, we've talked about the successes, Starlink, your cell service, but what were some of the challenges that you had to deal with this year that maybe you didn't expect, or that turned out the way you thought it would?
Well, the biggest challenge was that somebody stole our weather station during Francine. pretty much all that's on me because I didn't lock it up. I just assumed people would have more common sense and leave stuff alone, but I was wrong, and I own that. But we have mitigated it for the future. That was a real bummer. Um, Other than that, the biggest challenge was just trying to figure out what the season was going to do because we had that extremely fast start with Barrel, and we were all geared up and ready for like a 2020 or 2005 type of year where it's just going to be one after the other, and wasn't really prepared for that lull. And that was just weird to reconcile, like planning for that. Literally like going through the NFL playoffs, and then the Super Bowl is going to be, instead of a couple weeks away, that's going to be 8 weeks away. Like, what? I guess we did that in 2020 to some extent with the pandemic with certain stuff, but it just threw a weird monkey wrench into things. Well, when do I need to be ready again for a mission? We don't know. It's what's happening. Other than that, one of our smoothest years. If we just keep the thieves away from our stuff, we'll be okay. But a very successful year, and I can't wait to share some of what we captured at the conference down there in South Padre, and hopefully come talk to the students before the conference as well.
That'd be terrific. I can't wait to see what you've got. The video is going to be amazing, and the presentation is always good. And this year, you've got so much to work with.
Good team behind us that makes us all do what we do to the best of our ability. I'm very proud of that.
There you go. A lot of good comments coming in online today, mostly comments rather than questions. But one of the comments was kudos to the CPC for kind of put a bullseye in the late summer forecast for Florida, Georgia in terms of rain. That's where the big rain's going to be, and they were right on that.
Yeah, there were some pretty big signals. The science is getting better and better, seeing this stuff, and I can't wait for the next presentations. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Climate change involved with it, and the modeling has gotten better. We're not perfect, but the season was forecast to be potentially historic. That's what NOAA said in the headline. I don't remember the verbatim, but I think it said potentially historic season, and that is exactly what happened. And that's not fear mongering. That is, look, this is what we're seeing. It's just like our health. Someone says, hey, your blood pressure is up, your metabolic stuff doesn't look too good. You might want to make some changes. You don't yell back. I hope you don't yell back at the doctor. You're fear mongering, Dr. So-and-so. He's trying to help you. And these outlooks and whatnot, for the people that take it in stride and do something with it, I hope it did make a difference. And we actually hear from people that it did. So yeah, what a season. And always good to be here to talk about it and hear from other people too. Can't wait to hear these other ones today, these presentations.
Fascinating, Mark. Thank you. Thank you for all the input. And yeah, stick around. And if you have questions, ask these guys. I encourage you to jump in and do so. So fascinating conversation, a good transition. Thank you for that. Before we get to our next guest, let's take a moment and once again thank our sponsors who are here week in and week out throughout the hurricane season. And they're all with us at NTWC, National Tropical Weather Conference on South Padre Island. USAA. Great stuff, USAA. Thanks for all your help. The South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. They are the folks who are kind of the hosts, and we'll be there on South Padre Island first week of April. We encourage you to join us there. The Weather Company, Weather Boy, and Weather Call. Weather Boy, again, sponsoring scholarships for kids to come to this, college kids from across the nation to come to this. And we appreciate all that the folks at Weather Boy do to make that happen. All right, there's no tropical update today. There's no GeoTrek update. Instead, Bill, we just move on to the second half of the program. And again, Mark, stick around and jump in here anytime you'd like. Bill, take it away with the introductions.
Okay, we're going to shift gears into the climate sphere on the hurricane issues instead of the immediate here and now observations on that. And I'll introduce our two guests. Both are currently working with the Climate Central. We've had people from Climate Central on before, so it's great to have you guys back. First, I'll introduce Shel Winkley. I've known Shel from his previous job. He was the chief meteorologist at KBTX in Bryan College Station, which is Aggie land, so I'm up there a lot, and we've had him at our conference before. So welcome, Shel. It's good to see you. And yeah. And I believe Dan has come on board. I saw him a little snippet there that he's from Clearwater. There we go. Dan, right. Dr. Dan Gilford is atmospheric science with the folks at Climate Central, and he focuses on the climate variability and change and how it may affect the coastal regions, which is exactly what we're looking at to get it across to people through NTWC is how things are changing on the coast. And I think I'll start with you, Dan, if you would just give us a brief overview of what it is you've been doing and looking at, so that'll lead to questions from people like me that may not be as up to speed on it as they should be.
Yeah, so there's been wonderful research over the past several decades thinking about how human-caused climate change could be influencing the storms that are affecting these communities we all care about so much. As you mentioned before, I live in Orlando, Florida. I'm from Clearwater, Florida, so Florida in general is very important for me to work on this problem. I've been thinking about hurricanes and climate change for a while, and there's a couple different categories and sort of topics that we could cover in this, but we are focusing particularly today on intensity. There are changes in hurricanes that could do with the number of storms that could arise, or how much water the storm could carry and how much rain it could dump in a particular region, changes in steering flow, or how quickly or slow a particular storm is moving. But we are focusing at Climate Central on intensity for the moment, and so that's the topic I can sort of go into more if that's something that we want to cover.
Well, that's great, because at least from the short-term meteorologists like me, that's one of our biggest challenges is forecasting changes in intensity of any given storm. Rapid intensity, it doesn't really matter from a forecaster point of view whether we're seeing more rapid intensification or stronger storms. We still have to forecast it as the same. Any one storm, it's like it's the only one in town. You're going to work it like it was before. But from the bigger picture, resilience and community preparedness and things like that, it probably is important how much we know about the intensity of the storms that they might experience, and are they planning for strong enough storms? I already know the answer. We're not planning for strong enough storms regardless of no change. So we're exacerbating an already big problem. Alex forwarded me a paper you guys recently published on trying to on detecting the increasing number of storms of the intense kind, and the ability to maybe start giving attribution to how much of that increase could be influenced by climate change, mainly the warmer sea temperatures. Is that pretty much what you wanted to get across on that?
Yeah, so let me go into that a little bit. So we've been seeing over the past 4 decades a steady increase in the number of major hurricanes, that is category 3, 4, and 5 storms. Over time, it's gone up maybe 10 or 15% in the North Atlantic basin. And these increasing number of major storms mean that there has to be some increase in intensity. Now, where could that increase in intensity come from? In this particular study, we are focusing on the changes in sea surface temperatures, which really drive a lot of the upper bound in how quickly a hurricane can spin. So we focus on a theory which we call, which is known as potential intensity theory. Basically, it's the speed limit that a hurricane has given the environmental conditions it's encountering. So if a hurricane is encountering much warmer sea surface temperatures, it has a lot more fuel available to it to grow and convert that potential energy from those warm sea surface temperatures into kinetic energy in the forms of wind, and that's where we get the intensification of storms. So what we're really doing is looking at how the changes in intensity are rising from changes in the storm's environment. And we know that human beings are increasing the sea surface temperatures around the planet, and especially we see a strong signal of sea surface temperature warming in the tropics. So we know the speed limits of hurricanes have to be going up, and if they have higher speed limits they can reach, are these storms sort of experiencing that higher sea level change? Well, we argue in this paper that we can see and actually quantify how much faster hurricanes are spinning as a result of these increases in sea surface temperature.
Very interesting. I've been mostly following this incredible last couple of years of record anomalies in the tropical Atlantic. And I think we've talked on earlier shows with some people that also look at this, the challenge of determining how much of the warming we're seeing in the Atlantic is a natural variability aspect and how or other features, and how much of it is the known warming we're going to get from climate change? What are your thoughts on that, on this current Atlantic warm anomaly? Is it almost totally due to climate change, or are there other features you think play an important role?
Yeah, so if we look over a long period of time, say back to 1900, so just over 120 years, we see a strongly warming pattern that is consistent with increases in greenhouse gases during that period as human beings have continued to burn fossil fuels. We see along with this, especially during the 1960s and 70s, emissions of atmospheric aerosols that actually depress the sea surface temperatures during that period. And then as we cleaned up the atmosphere and removed these sulfuric aerosols that were cooling off the sea surface temperatures in the 1960s and 70s, the temperatures relatively got warmer because we got rid of that cooling effect. So these two combinations of factors are really changing sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. Both of these are human causes. We can see this evidence of this clear warming signal back to 1900 and a slightly faster signal back to 1970s expressing that there's these aerosols sort of bumping up on top of the CO2. We can see these effects really clearly if we look at both climate models and observations. So one of the things we wanted to do in our study was make sure we are using multiple lines of evidence in this particular approach. Climate attribution science has developed certain protocols, and one of them is that we try to use both observations and models, multiple methods to arrive at either similar or different conclusions that tell us how confident we can be in our results. And so for our observations, what we do is we look at how sea surface temperatures have changed over the last 120 years. And then we sort of rewind that trend back in time and see what would have the sea surface temperatures have been 100 years ago compared to what they are now. We see quite a bit of warming. We can also run climate models with and without greenhouse gas forcing and see how the sea surface temperatures respond. And we see, again, quite a bit of warming in the North Atlantic. So multiple lines of evidence are leading us to the conclusion that human beings are responsible to a large degree for a lot of the warming that we see in the North Atlantic Ocean, on the order of 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit compared to what they would have been in the world without CO2.
Yeah, that was pretty. I read that and I saw that it was pretty convincing. The sort of a two-edged sword there. The kind of a no good deed goes unpunished with cleaning up the aerosols. I guess until recently that was not really known, that the aerosols were enhancing a cooler ocean until fairly recently, from judging from the articles I've read on it. What do you think? How much more warming do you think we'll see, say, over the next couple of decades, assuming the relatively little change in the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, so one thing I should note is that our work only speaks to the past, and especially is talking about the recent past. One of the things we've been thinking about is how hurricanes can influence the hurricanes of how sea surface temperature warming can influence the hurricanes that we're experiencing almost in real time. For instance, we put out our 2024 report just days after Hurricane Rafael had made landfall in Cuba. And so we can do this kind of analysis very quickly. And so as we expect in the future, sea surface temperatures are likely to remain quite warm. You know, the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere is not going anywhere. And the forcing that it's providing to warm up the atmosphere and the oceans is not going anywhere. But we can sort of reduce the worst of impacts in the future by mitigating our climate influences right now. We need to rapidly and quickly reduce our climate emissions, and then we will have less forcing from those and have a cooler future as a result. And hopefully hurricane intensities will not continue to rise. But there is a lot of concern. There's been discussion in the community that we are seeing sort of a top out in our intensity of hurricanes. Category 5+ storms are becoming more and more frequent, and we should expect to see that in the future if temperatures around the planet continue to rise.
Yeah, that was, correct me if I'm wrong, that's been anticipated from decades ago. Some of the early work done on what the impacts of climate change would be on hurricanes. the warming ocean. It was obvious to fairly simple explanation of how it works. You know, you're working on the intensity, others are working on the rainfall, and there's fairly well established science on how warmer oceans can contribute to both of those increases. But apparently there's some thoughts that on the atmospheric side that the warming will have a stabilizing and drying aspect to the atmosphere itself that may reduce the actual number of storms that occur. Are we still thinking along those lines? We're apparently not seeing any of that yet, as far as the number of storms.
Yeah, so I think our work doesn't speak directly to frequency, and so I can't comment too much on that, except for to say it's consistent that we would expect that sea surface temperatures would be boosting the intensity of these storms, but we have to have a storm sort of to begin with. The other thing that could happen is you could have a warming across the tropics that could then affect the atmospheric composition in other parts of the tropics. It could, say, stabilize the atmosphere in another part of the tropics, and that could reduce the overall sort of sea surface temperature warming effect. That's something we actually studied in our analysis, and we find it can reduce the sort of influence on intensities by up to something like 40–45%. So there is this sort of stabilizing influence from the atmosphere that we have sort of a first order estimate on, a first estimate, but there's still a lot more research to be done in this area of, in addition to sea surface temperatures, what other aspects of the climate system are changing and how are those going to affect both intensity and the number of storms we're seeing.
Well, excellent. I look forward to future interesting reports out of you on that. I think it's time for me to shift gears a little bit and get into Shel's world. And so, Shel, what is the kind of work you're doing for Climate Central?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I was a broadcast meteorologist in Bryan College Station for almost 15 years. And I'm still in Bryan College Station, but basically what we're doing is I'm working with this attribution science to try to help journalists and meteorologists communicate it. And, you know, we just heard all of the science from Daniel. And when we first came out with this hurricane attribution, one of the things I asked him initially, I was like, what do we want people to do with this? Like, we have this information, we have the science, we understand climate change's impact on sea surface temperatures, which then boosts the intensity of hurricanes. But what do we do with that, and how do we communicate it so that people understand and can adjust because of it? We know in a warming world, we're going to see more intense hurricanes. Going off of Daniel's science and this hurricane attribution, there would not have been a Category 5 hurricane in the 2024 season. So what do we do with that? And I liked what Mark was saying about, you know, using Starlink to be more resilient and setting up these clusters and how that came in for communication. You look at some of the communities in Florida that are living on a renewable grid and have their power lines underground, and they're just more resilient. So I think one of the big things to do with the science is to really understand future hurricane seasons. We always talk about how we can build stronger, build better, and build smarter, but this really gives us a better understanding of the why and the real life impacts that we're seeing from this warming that on a day-to-day basis, if you ask today, you know, what's happening in the Caribbean, what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico, you probably don't know. Bill, you get a little bit of it today because there's some rain happening down there where you are, feeding from some of that moisture. But this is what that science can do. So that's what my primary job is just to help us communicate this science, because attribution science is still pretty new. For the longest time, we said that no one storm, no one weather event could be attributed to climate change, but that's not the case anymore. Now with attribution science, you know, these events would have happened. We would have still had a Helene and a Milton and a Beryl this season. But now we can understand the frequency of them, and we can understand how much more intense these have become, or more likely they've become, because of human-caused climate change.
Yeah, I guess your contribution in there could be described as, okay, this attribution science is new. Many of us that are scientists don't fully understand it. You can't imagine how tough it is to explain to the public at large, or elected officials and emergency officials, that have to plan for this sort of thing, we need to come up with mechanisms to explain in fairly clear terms how this works.
Exactly. And I think that's part of it, right? The communication aspect, be it a weather. I always say, like, I can be the smartest meteorologist, which by all means, I am not the smartest meteorologist out there, but I could be the smartest meteorologist with the best forecast ever. But if I can't communicate it to you so that you know what to expect that day, or if the storm's going to come or whatever it may be, then you're not an effective meteorologist. Same with climate change. We have this great science and we're understanding more and more, but we have to be able to communicate it well, and we have to be able to talk to each other well before a storm and after the storm, so that we can come together and understand that this is the reality that we're living in. And we need to, figure out a way to be able to live in this world that we have warmed. Bill, you mentioned it about Asheville, right? Like that was expected to be a quote unquote climate haven. And I think for things like temperatures, very possible. But you have to look at all aspects of climate change to understand where we're living, and then how this changing climate is going to impact it. Yes, they've had a flood close to this magnitude in Appalachia before. But we now understand with the warming oceans that it carries more moisture. You had the predecessor event that allowed that moisture to be amplified. And so this is what this science does. It really opens up that communication for meteorologists on TV, talking to their communities, but also just us talking to each other so that we can build stronger communities.
Yeah, I follow the messaging there on Helene rather closely, and I thought it was outstanding for the flooding aspects. I mean, they weren't mincing words. They were very without screaming at people. They were just some of them were saying exactly what happened, even. But I think the problem is the 1916 storm. There's nobody around that experienced it. The people that live there have never experienced anything like it, and it's very hard to crack through the denial that something like that can happen to you.
Well, and it's hard to fathom, right? Like when any time that the Hurricane Center or the Weather Prediction Center or your local weather service office uses the terminology that they do, we've seen it time and time again from Katrina, from Harvey, now with what we've seen this year. They don't say those words just to say them. Like they use them sparingly until they actually need them. But like with Harvey, I remember the first time I opened up the forecast model, it was the same day as the eclipse before Harvey. And it was the first time I think the GFS printed out 50 inches of rain. And I remember turning around to the other meteorologists in the Weather Center and I said, there's no way. And I just wrote it off. And then we learned that was the outcome, right? So it's just hard if you've never experienced or you see something so extreme like that, for you to wrap your head around it. But then also, like you mentioned, if you've never lived through it, or even if you've lived through something bad, but maybe not that bad, it's hard to know what to do to protect yourself and protect your family.
That's right. The folks when I was in Miami, the folks at the Hurricane Center that had been there for Andrew, one of their biggest concerns was the number of residents in Miami that were, say, 30 miles north of the epicenter of landfall, saying, we've been through a Category 5 hurricane. Our house came through it fine. And the answer is no, you haven't. You barely had Category 1 wind gusts where you live. It's a small, tight hurricane. And that's a real hard problem to solve. And the other thing is as you get farther away from it, it becomes less of something people think about. And I think that goes back to our discussion about the climate science. The changes are relatively gradual, and trying to saying things like crisis and emergency fall flat, I think, on people, because they think of crisis and emergency as right now, something's happening to me. I got to do something. And well, it'd be nice to do something about it, but that's probably not what hits most people's mind.
Right. And I think too, for that regard, climate is long-term, right? We've always said that weather is weather, climate is the longer aspect of this. And it has taken us a long time to get here, even though we've known for a long time that this point was very possible. But I think to that regard, this is happening to us. So even if you think that, even over Thanksgiving, I talked with a lot of my in-laws who, they were saying, we were talking about the cold weather, and they were saying, it's just not as cold as it used to be. Or we talked about the A&M and UT game. I had some family come down. I don't want to talk about the actual game itself, but we could talk about the weather with it. And it was the only game this season that we wore long sleeves for. And I was talking with my in-law and brother-in-law, and he was like, was it cold? Were there more cold games when you were in school? And we were like, yes. So like, we're in this moment. We are living it. You may not really fully recognize it every single day, but this is something that we do have to look at every single day and understand as we go forward.
Yeah, Hal Needham made a very nice graph that I use in the talks that I give on the changing climate. That's a timeline of when certain temperatures were exceeded for overnight lows in Galveston. I use Galveston because the warm overnight lows is usually with light winds or onshore flow, so you can't write it off as the Houston heat island effect. It's just the opposite. The heat island effect is the whole ocean's warmer, is what it is. But yeah,
right.
There was very few. It wasn't until 20s or 30s that there were low temperatures that didn't get below that got above 81. Now we've had several of the last 2 years where it didn't get below 87.
Right. Yeah, we know that nighttime temperatures are warming twice as fast as daytime temperatures. And I think one of the hardest things to communicate in the weather world is record high minimums. So the warmest low temperature of record. And I can speak to Bryan and College Station in Southeast Texas because that's what I track the most. But we break that record almost consistently when we get into really hot patterns in the summertime. Yeah. So it all ties together. And, again, what we're doing with Daniel's science here, and then with what we have, which is the climate shift index, which is more of our attribution science, it helps us understand that. It helps us understand, and I think this is always important when we talk about climate change communication, is this weather? Is this just one of those weird weather anomalies? Because those happen. Is it climate change, or is it something that we don't know in between? And what attribution science can do is to help us confidently say one or the other. And most of the time, to a degree, it's going to become climate change when you're talking about temperatures, whether it's ocean temperatures or it's the temperature you're walking out your door to.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. I find that temperatures are fairly easy to convince people of. The heavy rains and extreme rains and hurricanes are such rare events. It's kind of a probabilistic thing, I think. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but a big rain like Harvey is nominally more likely now than it was 50 years ago.
That's
but
right.
Almost 50 years ago, I was a pastor in San Antonio when Tropical Storm Amelia came in 1978 and dumped 48 inches of rain in 48 hours. And that's the blowback I get is, well, what do you attribute that to? And I say, I think it's more of a probabilistic thing, how likely you are to get one of these. So we've had these kind of storms before, we're going to have them again, and we may start seeing them slightly more frequently. Can't prove that because it's such a rare event, and we don't have that long period of history on the rain events.
Yeah, one more thing, and let Daniel maybe chime in on this as well. But John Morales in Miami said it best, and we saw it with Oscar. You had a tropical wave that sure had a decent potential for development for a while the Hurricane Center was watching it, and then they had it down to like a 10 or 20% chance for this thing to develop, and then within hours, it's a hurricane. And if we looked at the climate shift index for ocean, when we looked at the temperatures there near the Bahamas where this thing kind of came together, it was on the magnitude of hundreds. So we know that there's a dominant signal of human-caused climate change that warmed those waters, that fueled that storm. And that's important because when you have a system that's close to land and then it can rapidly intensify, that's when you catch residents off guard as well. And I think that's one of the things that we need to watch for with our communities.
Yeah, especially those tiny storms. They're not as long as they're over water, they're not getting disrupted much like the bigger storms from the big islands. Well, Tim, I think we're pushing time. You got any questions for Shel or Daniel?
No, the clock is ticking the top of the hour, so it's time to wrap this up. The only comment to kind of follow up, we don't attribute, we don't know, in terms of numbers, hurricane numbers, whether we're going up or down. We do know the intensity of those numbers is going up. So when you see, let's think about, Dr. Phil's forecast from Colorado State. Let's say he says, 10 named storms, 5 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes. In the future, that might be 10, 9, and 7, rather than 10, 5, and 2, based on what we're seeing here. I think, is that a reasonable summary?
That's right. The proportion of major hurricanes is increasing.
Yeah, and that's the concern, that of the 10, more will be significant. Gentlemen, thank you. Great conversation today. Daniel, thank you for the input. Thank you for your research.
Thank you.
Shel, it looks like the College Station Airport's grown since last time I was there. I assume you said you were somewhere else today. Newark, did you say?
Yeah, no, Easterwood Airport, College Station's bustling these days. Yeah, this is Newark, and it's actually, it's 39 degrees here. Might snow tonight, so I'm pretty excited.
You could have used that airport last weekend after the football game, I'm sure, in the College Station. And Mark, thanks for sticking around this last half hour. We appreciate it. Great stuff as well. Great conversation today. All right, guys. Thank you, Bill. Great job. That wraps up this season for NTWC Plus. It's been a fascinating season. 6 months ago, we had predictions, and we were concerned about those predictions. We were worried about them coming true, and indeed they have. And we've been here week in and week out to talk about that. We've given you tropical updates, given you updates from the middle of storms, and we've had great conversations like this one about where we've come and what we can expect. Don't everybody rush out and buy Starlink today. Maybe wait till Christmas and buy one for yourself, the Mini. But we appreciate everybody. Bill, terrific job all season long. Thank you, Bill. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
And thanks, Dr. Hal Needham, who's generally with us. He's out today, but he'll be back next season as well. We invite you to join us next season, next April, at the National Tropical Weather Conference on South Padre Island. We'll be there the 2nd through the 4th of April, with the student conference on the 1st for local high school students. A lot of our speakers will be part of that as well. Thank our sponsors who've been here all season long. USAA, thank you so much for all you do. South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Weather Company, Weather Boy, and Weather Call make these shows possible each and every week. We will be back with a show in February to talk about the upcoming conference. And then, of course, NTWC Plus will be back in full the beginning of the hurricane season. Thanks for joining us. Y'all take care. Have a Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. We'll see you next year. Bye-bye. Well, thanks to Alex.